Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Drawing School's series of creative conversations. Tonight, I'm really looking forward to a conversation foregrounding the 17th century painter Artemisia Gentileschi, who challenged conventions and defied expectations to become a successful artist and one of the greatest storytellers of her time. It's really wonderful that to illuminate her work, we have Letizia Treves joining us, who was curator of the hugely acclaimed Artemisia exhibition at the National Gallery last year. That was the first major exhibition of her work in the UK, and it included some of the artist's best known paintings, as well as recently discovered works. Letizia will discuss Artemisia's life and work with the artist Catherine Goodman, exploring what we can learn from her about striking out on one's own as an artist from the 17th century to the present. So to just introduce our speakers a little further, Letizia Treves is the James and Sarah Sassoon curator of later Italian, Spanish and French 17th century paintings at the National Gallery, which she joined in 2013, following a long career in the Old Master Paintings department at Sotheby's, where she was senior director and the principal worldwide specialist in Italian paintings. She's curated exhibitions including Beyond Caravaggio and Murillo. And in 2018, she championed the National Gallery's acquisition of Artemisia Gentileschi's self-portrait as Saint Catherine of Alexandria, which was the first painting by the artist to enter a public collection in the UK. So she'll be in conversation with Catherine Goodman, who's an artist, educator, and the founding artistic director of the Royal Drawing School. And she has a deep understanding of the National Gallery's collection, having drawn there for many years, and has been a trustee of the gallery since 2019. So welcome to you both, and welcome to everyone listening. And just to remind you all that you're very welcome to leave comments and ask questions in the chat, or raise your hand at the end, and you'll be invited to speak directly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Claudia.
Thank you. Hi, Letty.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm very excited to hear all the questions.
Yeah, I thought it'd be good just to give you a bit of a sense of our audience. So as well as our many guests tonight, we've also got a large group of young artists. And I think it's particularly interesting for them to hear about some of the insights you can give us really about Artemisia's life and how she sort of existed as an artist, put some flesh onto her personal history somehow. I think we should assume that at least 50% of our audience saw your extraordinary show.
That's a lot.
And I hope that many people saw it. I mean, I think what needs to be said about that exhibition is that somehow it had an expanded power, certainly for me, by the time that it came, you know, in the middle of this kind of extraordinary years that we're having, and the sort of poignancy of it being truncated by lockdowns and other things, and also the determination that so many people had to see it when they could. I found it very moving looking out of the window in pouring rain, out of the Sainsbury wing window, seeing people queuing up, you know, for hours to get in to see the show. And the critical acclaim was extraordinary, but somehow the fact that the appetite was so strong was also extraordinary.
And I think Artemisia would have been thrilled because,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
I mean, she has been sort of forgotten for centuries. So I think it was very heartening to see that, as you say, against all the odds, people were still wanting to come and see the show.
So Letty, will you take us through maybe just firstly a sort of virtual tour of the show, if you can, for those who didn't see it, and even for those who did, it would be good to revisit that.
Sure. I mean, I might say a few words just to begin with on sort of who Artemisia was, because not everyone sort of may know that. So this is she in the guise of St. Catherine, and this is the picture the National Gallery acquired in 2018. And this picture is really the inspiration behind the show, because it was in the course of the conservation treatment of this picture that there was a sort of mounting sense of excitement, not just in the media, but also in the kind of public domain. And we realized there was such sort of anticipation to see this picture when we could finally hang it. And we felt really we ought to do an exhibition on Artemisia, and there'd never been one in this country before. And so it was during the conservation in the summer of 2018 that with the director, with Gabriele, we decided we would do a show, and it was actually in the spring of 2020. So only about 15, 16 months later that we had sort of a slot for it. So I didn't have that long to put the show together. And that actually did in some sense shape the kind of exhibition I did, which, you know, it wasn't enormous. It was very selective and really quite compact. But we really realized that it was sort of time, and it was her time. And then it just so happened we rode on this kind of wave of Artemisia mania with, you know, the plays and the films. There are lots of films in production and TV series. So it's definitely sort of her moment. I mean, Artemisia in her lifetime was very successful, and we'll talk a bit more about this perhaps afterwards, Catherine, on sort of why it was such a rarity at that time to be successful as a woman painter. Her career spanned sort of more than 40 years, and she worked principally in Italy. She worked in Rome, in Florence, in Venice, and then ultimately in Naples for about 25 years. And she also came to London in the late 1630s. Quite briefly, her father was here. And her sort of originality was, it really lay in the fact that she tackled these sort of big biblical, mythological and historical subjects, kind of subject matter that really had been the preserve of male artists until that point. You know, any other successful women artists of the late Renaissance and early Baroque period were either portraitists or still life painters. And again, we can talk about why that was in a bit. And I think her success really lay in her very powerful storytelling. I mean, that to me, if I had to sort of summarize in one phrase, you know, she's a great storyteller. And, you know, she painted these very kind of strong, visually powerful, colorful, very rich colors, pictures with life-size figures, so very impactful. And she really was at her best when she had sort of a leading female protagonists, because she really kind of got under the skin of her protagonists and sort of stepped into their shoes. And I think you really get that from her pictures, the kind of the truthfulness of her storytelling, particularly when she's dealing with, as I say, female figures, female protagonists. She was kind of forgotten for centuries, and she's only really rediscovered in the 1970s, so really very recently, or in recent memory. And she is sort of heralded as this great feminist icon, and she's sort of championed as this great figure of resilience. And, you know, obviously I was very keen to sort of touch on that in the exhibition, and it's very much what's been embraced by all, you know, the critical acclaim of the exhibition and so on. But I think in the last sort of 20 years or so, with the kind of growing interest in Artemisia, there has been such a focus on her biography, and in particular on the episode of her rape as a young woman, that, you know, in some cases, I think that's really detracted from a discussion about her paintings. So what I really wanted to do with this show was, you know, just, yes, you know, a lot of things happened in her life, and I did want to sort of talk about those in the show, but it's really about her art. And it was about showing Artemisia as an artist and as a woman. So it was about showing her more fully in the round and trying also to make her come to life, because I think, you know, the two things aren't, you know, you can't separate the two, particularly in the 17th century. I think her art is powerful because she's a woman, and she was a powerful woman who, you know, went on to produce great art. So sort of in a nutshell, that was kind of my approach to the show. And part of this sort of bringing her as a woman into focus was giving Artemisia her voice. And so you'll see the picture I'm showing now is of the foyer of the exhibition before going in. And, you know, we have a large number of letters, mainly from late in her career, letters written to one particular patron, where she makes these incredibly bold statements. You know, you can say feminist statements, like this one, you know, I'll show your illustrious lordship what a woman can do. And I really wanted those words to sort of punctuate the exhibition. So you really got a sense of her character as you looked at her pictures. So the show was sort of broadly chronological, and it began, the first room began with her in Rome. She was born in Rome at the end of the 16th century. And her father was a painter. So Orazio Gentileschi was a painter of some success, but not enormously successful. And she trains with her father alongside her brothers. Now, he obviously saw that she had talent, but I think already in that very early part of her life, where she's trained alongside her brothers, there's a real distinction between what she's taught and what her brothers are taught. Because as she was a kind of young unmarried girl, she wasn't free to sort of roam around the streets of Rome. Her mother died when she was just 12. So she was very much confined to the house. And that meant that she missed out on a lot of the things that, apprentices would have done, the most important of which was copying the work of old masters, copying, Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, copying the antique sculpture around Rome. She wouldn't have done any of that. So she was exposed to very little. The pictures that she might have seen in churches and her father's art. But I think it's really important when you look at her early work and you sort of remember how little she was exposed to. And so the show really opened with the picture you see on the left, which is her first known signed and dated work from 1610, shows Susanna and the Elders. And she is 16 or possibly 17 when she paints this. She was probably apprenticed to her father, shortly after her mother died, so 12, 13. And she would have begun, grinding pigments, drawing, copying, perhaps engravings. But to think that by the time she's 16, she can paint such a refined and sophisticated picture is staggering. And across from that painting, the picture on the right, which shows Judith and her maidservant, this is a picture by Orazio, by her father, painted during the period in which Artemisia is training in his studio. And Orazio makes two appearances in the exhibition. And I felt that was very important because, everything she learned about art and painting, she learned from her father at this point in her life. So I really felt that his presence in that first room was important. I mentioned before the episode of her raid by the painter Agostino Tassi. This happened just a few months after she painted the Susanna, the picture on the left. And the transcript from the trial survives. It's a document that's in the archives in Rome, and we borrowed it here for the very first time, and you can see it nestled between the two paintings here. And I felt it was important to obviously talk about this episode in her life, but not in a kind of sensationalized way. And I opened it at a page where you could read Artemisia's words, because I think already here, you see the forcefulness in her painting, and just a few months later, you read the strength in her words, and you already get a sense of what a sort of determined and, strong character she was. And I think that was from the very beginning of the exhibition, I wanted to kind of strike that balance. And also in this first room, there were these two nudes. Now, it's hard because in these early years in Rome, there are very few works that are definitely by her. So we know the Susanna is it's signed and dated. Neither of these pictures are dated. And both of the pictures you're seeing on the screen have been thought to be by her father. And this is the problem. In these early years, her style is so close to that of her father, just technically, because of course she's learned how to paint from him, that you have to use other methods to sort of distinguish the hands. And I think that looking at these, there are sort of two key things that strike me. One is how realistic the female nude is. I mean, Orazio never paints a woman's body in such a kind of naturalistic and convincing way. I mean, she really understands the way kind of the flesh falls, the way a breast might fall. And you really saw that in the life-size picture of Cleopatra on the left. And then the other thing is the sort of the kind of eroticism, but the fact that she sort of, the kind of narrative interpretation of her subjects, I think already sets her apart. In the picture of Susanna, perhaps we'll talk about this more in detail later. I mean, Artemisia's is one of the very first pictures, I would say probably the first, in which Susanna is clearly saying no to these elders, and she is pushing them away. It's not an excuse to paint someone erotically on a bed. And here, although the figure of Cleopatra is very sensual, it's her sort of isolation in this bedchamber that I think is sort of slightly, well, I think quite kind of disconcerting. And again, I think she brings this kind of feminine perspective to her subjects, and perhaps we'll touch on this again in a while.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I thought can you tell us something about her relationship with her father? I mean, Orazio wasn't a very nice man, was he?
No, he wasn't. We don't really know. We don't really know, and it's been sort of romanticized quite a bit. And when she comes to London later in her life, Orazio is working in London at the court of Charles I. And some think that she sort of rushes to his bedside because he's about to die, out of affection for her father and so on. I think, we can only look at the facts. He was not a loving man. He was a very, very difficult, kind of irascible character. And we know that from kind of contemporary witness accounts. When he finally brings charges against her rapists, it is not out of love for his daughter. He probably knew that following the rape, Artemisia and Tassi continued for some months to have a relationship. And, Orazio probably knew that they were having a relationship. And what he hoped that Tassi would do the honorable thing and marry her. And when he doesn't, he brings charges against Tassi for having deflowered his daughter. So, effectively she's damaged goods. And the reason he brings it to trial is really to the kind of dishonor that this is brought on his name, on his family's name. So it's not really out of any kind of love for his daughter. And actually he puts her through quite an ordeal going through this trial. She's only 17. So I don't think he's a particularly loving. We do have a letter that he writes in 1612 saying, he writes to the Grand Duchess of Tuscany saying, my daughter has been painting for 3 years and has no equal. And it's the only kind of, his words that show he really did recognize that she had enormous talent. But it is also a letter in which he's trying to promote his daughter. So, it's again, something you have to slightly take with a pinch of salt.
Something you said when we were discussing this was that in maybe other circumstances, she would have just stayed in her father's studio and remained there as an apprentice or whatever, and that the circumstances of her rape and her then marriage. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah, no. I think that's true, and I think there are 2 episodes that really changed her life, and it's perhaps it's not given as much emphasis. But the death of her mother when she's 12, because she ends up being, she has 3 brothers. Her father, she ends up sort of looking after her younger brothers. She's the only woman in the household. It is a male-dominated household, and we have to remember, women in Artemisia's time, you were the property of your father until you became the property of your husband, or you were sent to a convent. And that was sort of the fate that waited. And you were not educated. So Artemisia doesn't know how to read and write at this point. She does teach herself later. So you were immediately kind of at a social disadvantage, an intellectual disadvantage. And then, of course, the rape itself, it was a horrendous episode, but the result of the trial was that Tassi was found guilty. And so Artemisia is immediately married off to the brother of her defense lawyer, an arranged marriage for certain. But with that, she moves with him to Florence because he's Florentine, and starts a completely new chapter. And I think, again, out of that misfortune, she turns that into an opportunity, but actually it's the best thing that ever could have happened to her, leaving her father's studio. Her brothers, remain apprentices to her father right to the end. So she is able to carve out, or she's given the opportunity to carve out a professional career as an artist, an independent career. This was one of my favorite vistas from the first room into the second. So this is the picture by Orazio of Judith with her maidservant, and Artemisia's, again, the fact that everything she learned from her father really stays with her, even in the years that she moves to Florence. You can see the picture through the doorways by Artemisia from, a few years later, and she's taken the composition and she's sort of adapted it. She's brought the 2 women much closer together. It's a much more kind of claustrophobic, less theatrical representation. But to me, it was important to show that, she didn't leave everything she learned behind. It stayed with her. And really the foundations of her art, everything she learned in those early years from her father, was very important even to her in the years that followed. And it's a really beautiful vista. So this second room looked at her time in Florence. So she moves to Florence, and she's in Florence for about 7 years. And it's in Florence that she paints, her most famous pictures, her most famous picture, which is the Judith beheading Holofernes. And I'm talking about the picture on the right of these 2 versions. The one on the left she paints in Rome. And then she probably takes a tracing of that painting with her to Florence. And the one on the right is in the Uffizi today and was almost certainly painted for the Grand Duke, Cosimo de' Medici. And although one was painted in Rome and one in Florence, I felt this was an opportunity too good to miss. I really wanted to put these two pictures side by side. And the painting on the left was originally larger. It's been cut at top and left. So, you know, in crop, it looks very Caravaggesque, but actually it was probably much closer to the picture on the right. But what's interesting is the one on the left is full of changes. So X-rays shows she's moving limbs. She's really working out how to sort of create this sort of wheel of arms and limbs in the center. And the one on the right has no changes in it at all. She knew exactly what she was doing, which is why we think she had a tracing of this picture with her. And tracing pictures, you know, that kind of making multiple versions or variants and adapting is something she does in Florence, and it's something she learns from Orazio. And it's something that's true of other pictures in this room, that she, you know, she clearly traced her sort of successful compositions and then would sort of transform these objects into different subjects or give figures different props. And to me, again, that brought an aspect sort of into focus that hadn't really been discussed before, which was her sort of the commercial side, if you like, her sort of business side, because she's having to sort of replicate and make pictures. So if you have a popular composition, you're going to, you know, and it's in demand, you're going to make replicas, you're not going to make variants. And again, that sort of clever, but also frankly, very kind of commercial approach to your art is something that people don't really like talking about, but it was true then as it is now. And we're going to talk a bit more in detail about the Judith, I think, at the end. So I just want to continue just giving you a sense of the spaces. So this is the other side of this room where you can see our self-portrait, the one with the dark black frame right in the center there. And for me, I have to say this was a real thrill because our picture was only discovered in 2017 in France, just a few months before we bought it. So it was newly discovered, newly attributed, and it had never been seen alongside other pictures by Artemisia. And it was in the process of restoring the picture and doing kind of technical images that we realized how closely related it was to the picture to its left where she's playing the lute, and to the picture to its right, which is a picture of Saint Catherine in the Uffizi. And the Uffizi, sort of spurred by our acquisition, also started looking at their picture, and they found doing x-rays of it that beneath that Saint Catherine in bright red, the picture on the right, is a painting identical to ours. So this sort of interrelation between these pictures becomes even more complex, but it looks like she probably painted the self-portrait where she's playing the lute, then she traced it into our painting and then replicated our painting again into another and then modified them all. And what's very interesting about this is we're starting to learn about her working practice. And this is the first phase of her working practice outside of her father's studio. And the only reason we're starting to learn this is because we bought this picture and have started sort of making these connections. And I think, and again,
Letty, where was our St. Catherine? In a private collection or something, or where it had been hiding for all those hundreds of years?
Yeah, so it was in a collection in France, and it was taken to an auction house in France without attribution. And it was only when they did research on the painting that they proposed it was by Artemisia, and they started showing it to Artemisia experts around the world. And so when they sold it in Paris at the end of 2017, it was as an Artemisia painting, but with no sort of previous history or bibliography or anything. And we bought it straight after that sale within months from the dealers who bought it in Paris. And all the sort of technical work on the picture was done at the National Gallery following our acquisition. So it's all very new, this. I mean, I think it's also, we have to see this as a kind of starting point. It's not, you know, in itself conclusive. I think it's already shown, though, that this practice of tracing and replicating and adapting and changing, you know, the important thing is also she's working on these three pictures at the same time. And this kind of, you know, and as artists, as most people tonight listening as artists, you all know what that means. Of course, you're working on multiple things at once. You're not working on one thing at a time. But, you know, for a lot of people visiting the exhibition, that would have seemed a real revelation. You know, the idea that an artist would work on multiple commissions at once, you know, and that's another aspect I wanted to bring out.
But also I wonder what those different versions meant to her. I mean, it's interesting to think, obviously, reproduction at that time was a completely different thing. So this idea of tracing and copying and moving things on, but the fact that they all they're not identical pictures.
No.
They're all very different. And what she was saying with that is quite interesting. And also, you know, the fact that presumably she was hoping to sell them all, which she had.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, though, the circumstances in which these pictures were commissioned, because the only one in which we know is the lute player. That was a picture for the Medici. It was in the Medici collections in the 1630s. It was almost certainly painted for them, and is a very literal self-portrait. And in fact, it probably records a live event. In 1615, we know that a Signora Artemisia, which was a very unusual name in Florence, so it's most likely Artemisia Gentileschi, was dressed up as a gypsy, and she sang and danced at a performance at the Medici court with other women. And here she's wearing a little earring, you know, it's clearly she's playing a role, and she's wearing a costume. So I think this is a very kind of plausible explanation. And then from that Medici painting, she has obviously created something in ours that began as a self-portrait and was only then transformed into a Saint Catherine in a second moment. So again, whether someone came into her studio and said, oh, I want a Saint Catherine, and she had this picture lying around, you know, we just don't know. So I think that the kind of patron, you know, who were these pictures for, is very important to think about, because, you know, there wouldn't have been a huge amount of choice from Artemisia, you know. I think she uses her own image quite a lot in Florence. And I think that's partly to do with the practical reasons, you know, the fact that it was a lot cheaper and easier just to use yourself, to look at yourself in a mirror. And later in her life, she complains about how expensive hiring models was. But they're also, I think, you know, she's a sort of singular figure in Florence, you know, a sort of clearly very talented female artist. And, you know, in 1616, so just the year after this self-portrait as a lute player, and around the time of these pictures that we're looking at, she joins the Artists' Academy, and she's the first woman to become a member there since its foundation, you know, 50 years earlier. So it's that moment in her career as well where she's really sort of finding her way. So I think there's a very clever, I see it as also a very clever marketing tool, you know, like Rembrandt does as well, by sort of putting himself in every painting. He's sort of also disseminating his image through his pictures, you know, and, you know, or today, you know, with Cindy Sherman dressing up in different guises. I mean, you know, I think there's an element of practicality, but also of really cleverly marketing yourself through your pictures.
And in these years, she had 5 children, is that right?
She did, yeah. So while she's in Florence, so she's married, not particularly happily married. She actually starts an affair with a Florentine nobleman towards the end of her stay in Florence. But with her husband, she has 5 children in 5 years. And that's something, again, that I really did want to bring out, because, you know, painting is a physical, I don't need to tell you this, but painting is a physical thing, you know. And in these 7 years, she spends 5 of them basically being pregnant and having just given birth. And, you know, she's the main breadwinner. I mean, actually 4 of her 5 children die, 3 in sort of infancy and 1 when he's sort of 4.5. But, you know, it must have been incredibly hard for her. I mean, the pressure of being the breadwinner, you know, they're living off her dowry. Her husband's a sort of, you know, good for nothing. And, you know, the sort of physical and financial pressure of those years must have been extraordinary. I mean, I'm a working mother. I have 3 children, and you know, I find the juggle almost impossible at times. I can't even imagine doing also such a kind of physical job as well. And you're just about making your career. You know, these are kind of formative years for her. That, you know, this is the years in which she establishes herself as a painter. What I also like in this slide particularly is you have this sort of lineup of self-portraits. So you see the way Artemisia saw herself. And then just through the doorway on the right, you have a portrait of Artemisia by the French painter Simon Vouet. And, you know, I just quite like the idea of having these sort of links through doorways and things, which normally, of course, with the crowds that you normally get in exhibitions, you know, they completely pass visitors by. But in this case, because of social distancing, I think a lot of people got to make those visual connections. And there it is again, the portrait through the doorway. And this room had a very different feel. I sort of wanted a pause from those very powerful pictures in the second room. And so in this room, we look at her return to Rome. And it's called The Hand of the Famed Artemisia, because when she returns to Rome in 1620, she is sort of heralded as this great kind of phenomenon, really. She's celebrated. So in those 7 years, she's completely transformed herself into an artist of success. And so as well as people wanting pictures by her, they also want portraits of her. And so in this room, I have this beautiful drawing of her hand, a medal, an engraving, a painting, you know, in every medium, you know, she becomes this sort of celebrity, really. And then the other thing in here is, you know, which obviously links to the idea of the hand of Artemisia, is I borrowed 5 of these newly discovered letters, 4 of which are by Artemisia, written to her lover. And again, going back to what I said at the beginning, to me, it was very important to bring her personality out. So of the sort of 35 or so letters that were discovered, I picked 4 or 5 that really brought out different aspects of her character. So some are very humorous, some are very tender. One is extremely erotic. You know, another, she's distraught. She's written it straight after the death of her little boy. But there's something really sort of spine-tingling in seeing a letter written by Artemisia, and they're very legible, you know, they're not that hard to decipher. And again, she taught herself to read and write, so they're written in you know, in terrible Italian. I can say that, I'm Italian, so with very little punctuation, with sort of phonetic spellings, but that only adds to their sort of charm, and you really sort of almost feel like they're a kind of stream of consciousness. And again, this feeling of her personality alongside her pictures, I really wanted visitors to sort of have that in this room. And I also included 2 portraits in here, because one of the letters is written by her husband and says, you know, our house is full of cardinals and princes, and Artemisia is so busy, she doesn't have time to eat. She doesn't even have time to write to you. And so I wanted to kind of evoke the kind of people who are really seeking works by Artemisia, but also these sorts of portraits of her. You know, so these portraits of kind of military figures and the nobility. She was renowned as a portraitist in her own day, actually, as well. But there aren't that many portraits that have been identified as by her hand. I think it's not surprising, because actually these 2 pictures look like they're by 2 completely different people. I mean, attributions with Artemisia are quite tricky. I mean, luckily she signs quite a lot, but I felt, you know, some portraits were important to sort of, you know, represent that aspect of her work. And then I wanted to dedicate one room to this sort of phenomenon I described at the beginning, which is this focus on the female hero and how she's really at her best when she paints these pictures with female protagonists. You know, here you have a Judith and a Susanna again, these subjects that she returns to again and again, but she approaches them differently every time. And, you know, these 2 paintings clearly show the influence of Caravaggio. And, you know, she's just returned to Rome. It's the 1620s. And, you know, although Caravaggio is long dead, it's the height of the sort of vogue for Caravaggesque painting. So she has a kind of renewed sort of acquaintance, if you like, with Caravaggio and with his followers, and a lot of the northern followers who paint these sort of candlelight scenes like Honthorst and so on. So this is her only candlelight scene, the Judith on the left. But I think, again, it just shows how inventive she is and how adaptable she is, and how she can paint sort of the same subject over and over and differently every time. And these pictures too, you know, and you know, we might talk a little bit more about this, but you know, her focus, in a way, she sort of created a market demand for her pictures and sort of specialized in these pictures in which there are these female protagonists. And so as a result,
tell us something about these, Letty, these 2.
Yeah. So she sort of built her success on these kinds of pictures. So in this room with Judith, Susanna, and on the picture on the left is a Magdalen in Ecstasy. Which is, again, quite a new discovery. So the show had these kind of very famous, well-known pictures, but also a couple of these newly discovered paintings as well. This was also came up in Paris in 2014 in a Sotheby sale, and had been restored since, and had been actually in an exhibition on Caravaggio and Bernini in the Rijksmuseum, but hadn't been seen yet alongside other pictures by Artemisia. So this was the first time. And then the picture in the middle is of Lucretia, so, you know, the Roman heroine, and then a biblical figure, Jael, on the right. But these pictures that kind of show, they're very charged, you know, kind of erotically charged, so they're kind of, you know, sensual pictures, but they're also violent pictures. You know, Lucretia's sort of squeezing her breast. She's about to plunge the dagger into her breast. I mean, the Magdalen in Ecstasy, I mean, she's not a penitent Magdalene as you normally see her, you know, weeping in the landscape. You know, she's completely oblivious to us, and she's sort of in complete abandon. And
yeah,
I think, you know,
of, thinking of Caravaggio's Magdalen.
Yeah, exactly.
And because in a sense, it's a similar scale, isn't it? And a similar, but a very, very different mood. Somehow.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of debate actually about, it was one of the things that in the show I sort of slightly shifted my thoughts on. I had it in this room as a picture of the 1620s, but I think it was probably a bit later and probably painted in Naples. And I think she probably did see, because actually Caravaggio's picture of the Magdalene in Ecstasy is compositionally very different. But the idea of showing her in this kind of state of abandon, a kind of ecstatic state of abandon, is something she might have borrowed from Caravaggio. And there were lots of copies around, but they were all in Naples at the time. So, you know, I think that's an argument possibly in favor of pushing this picture a few years later. But I think these pictures sort of show you it's what her sort of reputation was built on, but it's also, I think, you know, there was definitely this kind of appeal to collectors. I mean, collectors knew that by commissioning an artist like Artemisia, these subjects, they were going to get something no male artist could provide, you know, and that was sort of this more female perspective of these heroines. And there was definitely a sort of additional appeal, and you could argue titillation, in owning a picture showing violence or nudity painted by a woman. And these pictures were hung, we know from 17th century inventories, in collections of the time. You know, you would hang, you know, a Susanna, a Lucretia, a Venus, you know, you'd hang them all together, biblical, classical figures all together, because they were sort of, you know, seen as erotic subjects. And they would have been perceived as such, you know, in a collection.
What's so interesting to me, though, Letty, still, I think it was a very powerful, almost instinctual reaction to the show, and kind of given all the more power, perhaps, because the kind of cumulative power of having so many of the paintings together, which I'd never seen before, and I suppose many people had never seen before, was that somehow they felt as though that not on an intellectual level at all, but that as a woman painter, I understood them. Strangely, I felt like from the inside out, I understood them. So, you know, it may be that, and it was almost weird, because it was like I'd never experienced it before. You know, I've drawn from 17th century Italian paintings all my life, but I didn't get the opportunity to draw from these, but I did have the very strong sensation that they may have been, you know, erotic images or titillating images, but nevertheless, they felt like we feel a lot of the time. Yeah. And that was a very, very odd, I mean, it's the only way I can put it, really. It was such an odd experience.
I completely agree. And I think it's interesting you say as a woman painter, perhaps you could say just as a woman, they're very strong, these pictures, because, you know, I'm not a painter, but I felt very moved by her representations of women, because when I say, you know, they're erotic subjects, they are, but the way she paints them, I think definitely distinguishes, you know, she distinguishes herself from her male counterparts. I mean, take the Lucretia, for example. It's the kind of steely determination of Lucretia in this picture that to me is really striking. She's not sort of languidly about to, you know, Guido Reni paints her as this kind of languid, you know, woman, frontal, you know, completely naked, about to plunge, but not really convincingly plunge a dagger. She is, you know, strong. She's a woman of real flesh and blood. Look at those thighs. You know, she's grasping her breast. She's meant to be doing this, if we're to believe Livy, in front of her husband and her father, but she's completely on her own. She's completely isolated. And the way she's cropped this composition very, very close, it gives you the sense that you're sort of beside her. You're actually witnessing this event. And I think all of that, the way she composes her pictures, the way she, you know, there's something, the forcefulness of the overall image also there's a kind of tension with the way this picture's painted, which is incredibly crisp in the handling of the drapery. And then this red cloth, which has this kind of gold fringe, the tassels tickling her thigh, you know, very delicately. And you have these sort of frictions. Similarly, in the picture of Susanna here, it's an incredibly strong image. But when you start unpicking it, you know, I'm not sure, you probably can't see it, but she's sort of sitting with her legs in the fountain, and her chemise, this cuff of her sleeve, the sleeve of her chemise is sort of dragging in the water, and she's desperately clutching at it, trying to cover herself. And it's just the way she can combine little details like that with a kind of overall strong effect, I think, is one of her greatest sort of gifts. And the Judith beheading Holofernes, which we'll look at in a minute in a slightly closer detail, you know, she has some really wonderfully vivid details to, again, kind of bring out the kind of the realism, the truthfulness of them.
Let's keep going.
Sure. I mean, not much to go. So she stays in Rome till the end of the 1620s. Then she goes briefly to Venice. And then from 1630, for the next sort of 25 years of her life, to the end of her life, she is in Naples. And you have to remember, Naples in the 17th century was under Spanish rule. So for her, going to Naples was quite an important step. It basically opened many doors, and it presented lots of opportunities. And what I wanted in this room was for people to be struck by the sheer scale of her pictures. Suddenly she's painting altarpieces. So these are enormous, these pictures. And you walked into this room and you felt kind of dwarfed by them. And it's important to remember, until this point, not only is she not painted on this scale, but she hasn't painted anything that's for public display. So these are altarpieces that were going into churches and cathedrals. But until this point, all her pictures are in private homes. And, you know, most artists were all vying for those big church commissions. But because she's a woman, she has, you know, a private kind of client base. But in Naples, that changes. And that changes because she's welcomed into the artistic community there, in particular by one artist, Massimo Stanzione, who helps her get the commission of the altarpiece on the right of San Gennaro. And she's probably welcome because she's not really seen as a threat, because actually the artists in Naples had sort of, you know, hounded Guido Reni and Domenichino, other artists who'd come from outside Naples. There was a sort of mafia around Giuseppe de Ribera, but somehow Artemisia is accepted, and I think it is because she's a woman. She's not seen as a threat. She can't paint in fresco. She's not been trained to paint in fresco, and they're all vying for these big fresco commissions in the churches. And what she does is she starts painting alongside other artists and collaborating with other artists, whether in the case of the San Gennaro altarpiece on the right in this picture, she contributed 3 altarpieces to a series of 12 in the cathedral in Pozzuoli, and they're all still there. Or in the case of these 2 pictures that you see on screen now, she paints the figures and someone else paints the landscape and someone else paints the architecture. And this kind of almost factory-like production, you know, because you'd say, I'd paint the figures, then you'd pass it to the landscape painter and the architectural painter, was something that was completely normal, not just in Naples, but elsewhere. And the fact that she in Naples is doing that, I think, again, shows that her productivity is up. She actually founds a busy workshop, you know, as well, in which we think her daughter was also trained. Her only surviving child, Prudencia, we know grows to be a painter herself. We don't know any pictures by her, but she was almost certainly trained by Artemisia. The big challenge for me in this room and the next, which are in Naples, is, you know, Artemisia spent 25 years in Naples. It's a long period of time, but it is not the best part of her production. And, you know, as a curator, I always remember Gabriele saying to us, our director, saying to me, you know, as a curator, you have to defend your artist when you do an exhibition, you know, and that was very kind of present in my mind. And I think in these years in Naples, because she has a lot more kind of workshop collaboration, because she's producing a lot more, you know, the quality of a lot of the work that is being produced is not great. The attributions are all over the place because, you know, what's workshop, what's her, what's someone imitating her. And so with these rooms, what I did was I really focused on the documented pictures, on the signed pictures. And by doing that, also kept the quality really high. The picture sort of in the middle that you can see it on a sort of angle, which is in the Prado. This picture was painted for King Philip IV of Spain, and again is one painting in a cycle. And Stanzione got her that commission as well. So, you know, she is really working for such a kind of broad client base in Naples, but of course also in Spain. So, you know, there is a reason why she stays in Naples. The picture of Susanna on the right, that's her last known signed and dated work. It's a very damaged picture, only discovered in 2008 in the Pinacoteca di Bologna in the stores. Very dirty, very damaged. And then they restored and cleaned it and found fragments of a signature. Very theatrical, so different from that first Susanna in the first room. But, you know, she's almost 60 when she paints this picture. And I quite like the idea of bookending the show with these Susannas, because it is a subject she sort of goes back to again and again. These are 2 other pictures that she paints in Naples. And so I decided to actually end the show not on this last damaged Susanna, but actually to end on her time in London. So it's sort of slightly out of chronology, because her time in London, you know, I felt for a show in the UK, you know, was apt, but also it allowed me to bring her back alongside Orazio. So Orazio comes to London in 1626 and is court painter to Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria until his death in 1639. And Artemisia arrives, we don't know exactly when, but probably in the last year or so of Orazio's life. And it's thought that she may have helped work on his final great commission, which was the big ceiling paintings that were originally in the Queen's House in Greenwich and are now at Marlborough House in St James's. And so in this final room, I wanted to create a bit of a kind of dramatic finale and a sort of theatrical ending to the show. So the picture by Artemisia on the left is the only picture that's thought that we know was painted in Venice at the very end of the 1620s. And then almost contemporaneously, the picture on the right painted by Orazio in London. And what I wanted to show was really that, you know, obviously the labels were very informative, but I wanted visually for people just to see, here they are, father and daughter reunited in the last room. And what are superficially quite similar pictures, you know, they're both very theatrical, very similar scale. You know, these figures sort of set out on a stage. The more you look at them, the more you realize actually that the aims of these 2 artists were very, very, very different. I mean, Orazio's is absolutely phenomenally well painted. I mean, it's dazzling in its technique of all these different sheets and textures and silks, but the figures are sort of mask-like, whereas Artemisia, it's all about the drama, the human emotion. And so you can kind of see how these 2 artists' interests really lay in different, you know, in sort of very different directions. And then the very final picture in the show, you'll remember in the foyer, the sort of outline of her arm painting, you know, which we used as sort of the main image as you walked into the exhibition, that's taken from this picture. And this is the painting in the Royal Collection that's said to be self-portrait as the allegory of painting. And, you know, it's just such a sort of bold and actually incredibly modern picture. I mean, it's amazing this picture dates from the 1630s. And I think you can get sort of bogged down in discussions about whether it is or it isn't a self-portrait. I don't think she meant it as a literal self-portrait, and I don't think it is. She was in her 40s when she painted this picture, apart from the sort of practical impossibility of painting yourself at this angle. But she's associating herself with the allegory of painting. And this is, for me, you know, I wanted to end on this because it just encapsulates what painting is for Artemisia. And it is this kind of inspired, you know, energetic figure. She's kind of rolled up her sleeves. She's about to sort of embark on this this new work that you can see the canvas prepared and ready to go. And the kind of dynamism in this picture is astonishing. And, you know, you always forget how tiny it is because it's, you know, a half-length life-size picture, but it has such power. And I felt it was a great thing to end on because, you know, it sort of echoes the words in the foyer when you walk out and see them again, you know, let me show you what a woman can do. And here you are, you know.
Yeah, it very definitely is a political statement as much as, you know, a wonderful painting, because she probably needed to say, she probably needed to feel that she was, whether it's a self-portrait or not, that she was leaving an image of herself as a painter.
Well, interestingly, in the Royal Collection, the reason it's much discussed is that the inventories talk about two works. One is described as a self-portrait and one as an allegory of painting, both by Artemisia Gentileschi. And I think there'd been confusion in the past in conflating these two references into one picture, whereas now everyone agrees they're two separate references. So she clearly had left a self-portrait as well. But she puts her initials right beneath the painter's palette, and they're very prominent when you're standing in front of the picture. which, you know, she's clearly associating herself with the painter, you know, in this painting.
It was wonderful, Letty. I feel like we've been through the show with you, which was it's great, given that it's no longer there, to have had that experience. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I'm wondering whether we shouldn't take some questions now, because we've got 10 minutes.
Shall I stop sharing my screen? No.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful, and bringing Artemisia to life for us. Special pleasure for me, because I was in Florence, so in her territory last year by the exhibition. So that was really wonderful. Yeah, so we're open to questions. Something I was thinking about, particularly in relation to the Saint Catherine self-portrait with the wheel, and how it seemed connected to, I think, what you were describing as the wheel of limbs. You used that lovely description of wheel of limbs, often in moments of distress or crisis in other works. But in the self-portrait, that sort of violence or struggle is kind of contained or implied rather than overt. And I learned that the painting toured to GP surgeries after its acquisition, I think. And I just wondered, you know, this incredibly powerful image, you know, if we know how people responded to it, particularly in those locations, and thinking about it as a work which says a lot about struggle, whether it's creative struggle or otherwise.
Yeah, so when we acquired the painting, and it was in conservation treatment at the time, we were basically, our director said, I want to do something different with this picture. He could feel the kind of growing kind of excitement around the country about this picture. And we thought about what to do with this picture, and we felt it was a picture that could be unpicked in lots of different ways. In terms of telling the story of Artemisia, it was a very kind of inspiring story, both as, you know, just as an artist who'd overcome, you know, enormous challenges of just being a woman in the 17th century, but also obviously of the rape, to just being a great work of art, you know. And so we came up with this idea of touring the picture to sort of unusual venues and really using it as a kind of outreach program, really. And so the picture went for a period of about 3 months, but only 4 or 5 days in each place in the spring of 2019. It first went to Glasgow Women's Library, where we unveiled it on International Women's Day. Then it went to a GP surgery, that's right, where the focus, so in Glasgow, the focus was on Artemisia as a feminist icon. But at the GP surgery, the focus there was very much, we work with paintings in hospitals, the charity paintings in hospitals, about kind of art and well-being and the importance of, well, we all need that more than anything right now. And so there was a kind of different, you know, aspect to the kind of unpicking of this picture and the interpretation. We took it to a girls' school in Newcastle, where we actually held a careers event about, it's the Sacred Heart School in Newcastle, which was set up by these two very pioneering women in the 19th century. And so there it was about kind of the women as a kind of, you know, kind of inspiring female role models for the girls. And that's what we talked about. And we held a careers event with lots of women who'd been involved in the tour, from, you know, people in design, the graphic design and social media, to the truck driver, to, you know, we all went and presented sort of for 5 minutes about our own paths and our own careers, to kind of also make them realize that, you know, you can sort of change your life. You know what Artemisia did in her own time, a lot of it was down to sheer determination and hard work. You know, and I think it was a very inspiring kind of message for people. And then the picture traveled to a women's prison in Surrey, where we held some workshops there with the inmates. And then it ended up at Waltham Forest as well. So it was a really unusual tour. But I think it was very much about not reaching the maximum number of people. It was about reaching people who had never stood in front of a work of art before and had never walked into the National Gallery before. And I have to say, on a personal level, I found it a really enriching process. I mean, much more so than talking to lots of art historians about Artemisia, you know, because I think that when you talk to people who look at art fresh, you don't come with the baggage of, you know, art historical knowledge. And I don't think you need that when you look at Artemisia. Like I said right at the beginning, she's a great storyteller, and everyone loves hearing stories and telling stories. And what really shaped, in my mind, the exhibition was that tour, because I realized what people were really interested in her was her character, her personality. And so actually it's only then that I really went after the letters, and I really realized that that whole aspect of Artemisia had to come out in the show. It can't all just be about the rape, you know, it's got to be about her art, but also her as a woman.
Yeah, that was really a great addition. Just, and yeah, hearing about her grief at her child's death and letters to her lover, and it was wonderful, that room. Claudia, there are more questions.
Yes, there are. So one question about her business practice and her studio. So how easy it was or not for her to set up a studio as a woman, and mentioning that the exhibition showed that she left Florence with debt. So yes, that was kind of business practical aspect and the challenges of working as a woman at the time. So how
well, financially, I mean, she was very successful in her lifetime, but she seems to have been kind of ridden with financial difficulties and debts her whole life, and that might be because she was alone for much of it, and because she separates from her husband as soon as she comes, very shortly after she returns to Rome. So, you know, for much of her life she's on her own, and she's often, you know, writing to her contacts asking for money. I mean, I think the difficulty of setting up on your studio is that women didn't really do that. And it really began with the training was very difficult, which we talked about a bit. The fact that you weren't able to go around and copy things freely. You couldn't belong to academies. And, you know, an academy wasn't just an art school. So, you know, even if Artemisia became a member of the academy in Florence, she still couldn't go to life drawing classes, or, you know, she couldn't participate in meetings and so on. She was kind of nominally a member, but there were only certain things that she could attend. And I think belonging to an academy was so important. It was not just about meeting other artists, which until that point, Artemisia she'd been sheltered. She hadn't met any other artists. So you met other artists, you met poets, writers, intellectuals, you met potential patrons. I mean, belonging to an academy opened so many doors for you as an artist. When she moved to Florence, they lived off her dowry. She basically got half her dowry up front. And with that, she set up the studio. We know she bought fine clothes because she knew she had to look the part. And, you know, so, you know, she ran up debts, but that's also because she knew you had to behave and dress and present yourself in a certain manner to be seriously considered by the Medici, you know, as an artist, to be entertained and sort of employed at court. She set up a studio, we know, in Florence, in her father-in-law's house to begin with. Her father-in-law was a tailor. So, you know, it's nice to imagine that she must have got beautiful material from him and so on. But later she sets up on her own. We don't know about Rome. We have no idea what her studio was like in Rome, but we know that in Naples it was a practice. You know, there were assistants and they were churning pictures out. It was, as I said before, she was working with other artists as well. So it was a lot more organized.
Yeah, and that's why it's so interesting to hear about then the shift to Naples and the workshop there. But also I wondered, did she have a creative relationship then with her husband? I mean,
no, not at all. Not with her husband. Her husband is said to have been a painter. We know nothing by him, but I think he's also been said to be an apothecary, because they were often, you know, pigment traders, and with his father being a tailor, I suspect it was all sort of slightly the same, you know, or connected, you know, trades. But he wasn't an artist of any note. No.
But the role of dress and thinking about the textiles and the environment she would have been in, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Just some questions about sort of preparatory works and drawings. There's a question about whether there are any drawing portfolios holding her cartoons, tracings, and were the cartoons made on vellum or another material? And then just sort of following on from that quickly, how did it feel to get the X-ray results back from the Uffizi to find that it was originally a copy of the portrait discovered in France? So.
Yeah. Just on the drawing question, it's an important one, actually, in the context of this audience, really important. Because she's often said not to be a very good draftsman. You know, I mean, some of her drawing is, you know, the sort of foreshortenings of faces and, you know, but she definitely drew a lot. I mean, we have to remember with, you know, the arrival of Caravaggio and this kind of new revolutionary way of painting directly from the model, directly onto canvas and skipping the stage, if you like, of lots of laborious drawings, was sort of both heralded as this great kind of innovation, but also really lambasted. So it was a kind of love and hate thing. Now, Orazio embraced this way of painting just in those years that Artemisia was learning in his workshop. So she must have kind of adopted that through her father. And, you know, the changes she makes in painting, which are considerable, suggest she's obviously planned her compositions to a degree before she starts painting, but she's making changes as she goes, because a lot of the pictures show changes and you know, alterations in figures and so on. We know she did drawings. Now the cartoons, because of their function, by cartoon I mean a tracing that you would then, you know, transfer. And we don't know how she transferred, because these, you know, it's very hard to see in 17th century paintings through any of the kind of scientific methods that we use, like X-ray or infrared. You can't really see any kind of drawing. But these kind of transfer methods, they would have been destroyed in the process of using them as part of kind of your workshop, you know, kind of practice. But we know she had drawings. And in fact, as she escapes from Florence, all of a sudden, you know, running debts, you know, with lots of debts, an inventory of her studio is taken. There's a cabinet with drawers described full of drawings, full of her drawings. So you think there must have been lots of them, and where have they all ended up, you know? I mean, the contents of her studio would have, you know, presumably have been destroyed shortly after her death, you know, if the studio didn't continue. And what was the other question about the Uffizi X-ray? Yeah.
How did it feel? How did it feel to see the X-rays?
Oh, so exciting. I mean, I have to say there were two things. One was seeing their X-rays and seeing our picture underneath was just phenomenally exciting, because it, you know, undoubtedly placed our painting in Florence in those years. The other really exciting thing was we traced our picture, and in Hartford, they traced their lute player, and we FedExed each other's tracings to each other. And that moment with Larry, I remember it one morning where we put their tracing on our picture and it matched perfectly. You know, it was so exciting, because we realized, we started understanding how she would have worked. I mean, it was such a perfect match. There's no way she just sort of had remembered, you know, done it from memory or sort of, and suddenly we started piecing together that she must have adopted this working practice for these three pictures.
Fantastic. How are we doing, Claudia? Have we got time for another question? Or
I think probably just one more. Yeah, so a question of sort of her impact. I mean, that was something I was thinking about with her workshop in Naples and her influence on that community of artists. But someone's asked something similar around, did she have apprentices who would have taken practice forward?
Sorry, did she have?
Oh, sorry, did I just cut out? Sorry.
Yeah.
Apprentices who would have taken her practice forward.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. We don't really understand the makeup of her studio in Naples. We don't know how many people were in it. We don't know what they did. And it's actually a subject of an exhibition in Naples in a couple of years, or actually in 18 months. Just looking at her activity in Naples and trying to unpick a bit this situation. But and they're doing quite a lot of archival work as well. I mean, what's a bit odd is she took a lot from other artists, but I don't think she actually had a kind of lasting legacy. I don't think she you know, in terms of her style on other artists, I think what she did in Naples is she absorbed and she adapted, but I don't think, you know, there were lots of followers, named or nameable followers of Artemisia. And I think that's also to do with taste, because just as, you know, we don't know when she dies. She's last recorded in Naples in 1654. She may have died in the plague in 1656, but let's say mid 1650s. And around the middle of the century, there starts to be a kind of shift of taste. And in Naples, you know, you remember her last Susanna is incredibly sort of theatrical. And it's that kind of high Baroque taste, which has already moved far away from that very kind of rugged naturalism of the earlier part of the century. And as you move on into the 17th century, towards the latter half of the 17th century, there's a shift towards a much more kind of classicizing style. And so I think partly to do with fashions, she is quite quickly forgotten, but so is Caravaggio, you know, and so is Orazio. You know, these artists, these kind of naturalistic painters are sort of forgotten by the end of the 17th century and actually rather despised in the kind of 18th and 19th centuries. And that's why it took so long for them to sort of be recognized. And, you know, I know it seems in very recent memory, the 1970s, for Artemisia's rediscovery. But, you know, Caravaggio was only really rediscovered in the early 20th century, you know, and Orazio probably in the kind of 1950s. So it just took that little bit longer for Artemisia, but you know, I think it's a lot of it is to do with taste. And so when she died, I think that didn't help in kind of, you know, preserving any kind of legacy.
Gosh, well, thank you, Letty. That was
Right.
that was wonderful.
Yeah, a real inspiration for everyone, and much appreciated, and many comments and much appreciation in the chat from everyone. So thank you so much for illuminating Artemisia's work and taking us through the exhibition. And thank you so much, Catherine, too.
Yeah.
Well, and thank you to everyone listening, and please do join us at the same time next week when we'll be exploring Leonardo and the visual poetics of water. So thanks once again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.